All right, we're going to give it just one more minute here, but while the folks that are here, you can go ahead and get a head start on our Menti. So a lot of our participation today is going to be through Menti. You can either go to menti.com or use this QR code on the screen. That'll set you up for success because we'll have just a couple questions coming up that you'll get to interact with and answer through Menti. So I'll leave this up so that you can get prepared. All right, hopefully all of you are on Menti and ready to go. So my name is Chloe. I am a public engagement specialist here at Shed, and I'm going to be hosting this webinar today. So it is a webinar format. That does mean that while you can see us, we won't be able to see you, but there are plenty of ways to participate. I do have the chat and the Q&A open. And we'll have that Menti not only throughout, but we'll have a Q&A with the panelists at the end as well that you can ask questions through that Menti, through that chat or that Q&A to us. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the other speakers in this webinar today. We're going to be hearing from Mallory, Melissa, and Brian. Starting with Melissa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Melissa Youngquist. I am a research biologist here at SHED, and I run our amphibian conservation and wetland restoration program.
Brian?
Hi, I'm Brian Gill. I'm our Senior Director of Government Affairs and Policy, where we advocate for good public policy around SHED's priorities.
And Mallory.
Hi, everyone. I am Mallory Hebert, and I'm the Coordinator of Government Affairs and Policy on the team with Brian here at SHED.
Folks, we're really excited to have you here today. Through this, we're going to be learning quite a bit about the value of wetlands. Wetlands are a critical habitat in Illinois, and they're shared and relied on for the health and well-being not only of the native species that live there, but also us humans. Also, wetlands desperately need our support, and they benefit most when we work together. So we're going to be hearing a lot of those themes throughout this webinar. And just as a getting started, those of you who are already on the Menti, that QR code for those of you who are not, when you hear wetlands, what word comes to mind? So go ahead and get in that Menti. Feel free to drop some words that you think of. I'm going to change our screen so we can see what folks are saying. All right, we're seeing a lot of fun words come in. So far, 56 responses. One of the biggest ones is frogs. We're also seeing marsh, swamp, biodiversity, endangered, abundance, unappreciated, conservation, preservation. So really interesting to hear about already what you think about when you think about wetlands. And we're going to have the opportunity to learn even more from Melissa.
Thank you. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about wetlands, which you already know, the biodiversity hotspots that they are, as well as a very brief sort of high-level overview of the research that I'm involved in that SHED is helping with. So I thought I would just introduce ephemeral wetlands. And these are wetlands that dry every year. So they are temporary, they're wet mostly sort of in the winter and spring and dry in the summer, and they can take on many forms. So in this first image, we have a very small ephemeral wetland in a forest preserve. Next. And this is a much larger sort of open marsh in the Calumet area, and it's surrounded by industry. So the placement of these sites in the landscape in Chicago, it can be very different. And the next is another sort of these grassland, marshy wetlands that we have in Cook County. This is a much more pristine Illinois Nature Preserve area. And so just a quick rundown of ephemeral wetlands. Again, these are seasonal ponds. And so they have a wet season and a dry season. And that means that there's a huge diversity of animals that come through these sites. Some use them when they're only wet, like dragonflies, salamanders, frogs. Some use them year round, like deer and raccoons and squirrels. Coyotes come by these sites. We have owls. And so really every taxa, every type of animal you could imagine is related to these wetlands in some way. They also have these spongy soils. Sorry, I can go back one moment. Spongy soils, and that means that they're really good at absorbing water and collecting water. And this helps us with flood control. They filter and purify our water. And because of this, they can also help us with climate change resiliency and creating these landscapes that can persist despite the changes in precipitation and temperature that are predicted with climate change. Thanks, Chloe. Next. So I thought I would give you a quick rundown of the animals that are here in these ephemeral wetlands through different seasons. So in the fall and winter, we're not seeing the adults of these species, but their eggs are there. And so dragonfly and fairy shrimp and copepods and fingernail clams, caddisflies, even some salamanders like the small salamander, their eggs are in these habitats when they're dry and you might not even notice them. Next. And then in the spring, so what we've just experienced is our emergence of these animals, the adults, and their migrations. Some of these species, like our mole salamanders, move on like a warm, rainy night, and they all converge on the pond, hundreds or thousands of salamanders all at once for a few days. That's the only time in the year you'll see them. And then some species like chorus frogs are just there for 2 or 3 months, hanging out, doing their thing. As also we have our turtles coming out of their nests or from the bigger wetlands and moving into our ephemeral sites. Next slide. And we get just so much life just bursting forth. We have our amphibians are coming and laying eggs. The eggs that were there all winter have hatched out. And so we just have these larval amphibians, larval insects, just huge diverse food web in our wetlands. Next. And then soon, really, in another month or two, our sites will be drying and all our frog tadpoles that we have are metamorphosing, the salamanders as well. They're hopping away. Next. And the insects are also metamorphosing. Our damselflies and dragonflies are leaving our wetlands, and the birds that came to eat the aquatic insects are now flying away as well, following our terrestrial insects as they leave these dried habitats. Next slide. And so as a researcher, I'm monitoring these sites. And what does this look like? While we get out there, I have lots of interns helping me every year. We have our waders, our nets, our buckets, and we're going out and we're just sort of sampling and trying to figure out which tadpoles are there, what salamanders, who's there when it's dry. We get turtles. And so it's just a really fun time going out and documenting the species that are in these habitats. And that's me sorting through some muck looking for some tadpoles. And so at Shed, my research is really all across the county. I kind of have these sort of 4 or 5 core regions, forest wetlands, grassland wetlands, permanent marshes. And the question that I'm answering in partnership with forest preserves and Chicago parks is, does restoration work? What kind of methods are best? And what do we need to do to create these resilient landscapes that can support people and wildlife into the future under climate change scenarios? Next slide. Yep, so I work really closely with forest preserves, Chicago Park District, and our conservation action team. And these are all the folks doing on the ground restoration. And I'm coming in to document the amphibians and the insects that are using these habitats. Next. Here's just like one quick example of kind of what wetland restoration can look like through partnerships. And so this is work that was done by the Forest Preserve of Cook County, Department of Aviation, Open Lands, and USACE doing wetland mitigation about a decade ago. And so they took this landscape that was all agriculture in the 30s, and then was converted to sort of more forest in the early 2000s, was actually historically wetland. And so through big efforts, they converted all this habitat back to natural meadow and grassy wetlands. And then I am coming in and documenting to see, does this restoration, who comes back after we do all this work? Next slide. And so what I'm finding across the county is that even in our smallest, unrestored, tiny wetlands that you might not think can host anything, we get toads and chorus frogs. And so these are kind of our superhero species in Cook County. We find them everywhere. They are hanging on, they're doing well, they're well adapted, and can use a lot of different habitats. So even the ponds you think, maybe don't need that one, we do need that one because we have amphibians there. Next. So again, we have a lot of restored grassland and wet meadows, these sort of emergent wetlands. And here we start to see our leopard frogs. Leopard frogs are a grass species, and this is telling us that restoring from agriculture to wetland is working. We're getting our leopard frogs to come back. Next. And then in our forest preserves that we've been maintaining for a long time, they have permanent ponds, they have temporary ponds, they're well restored. We get to see all our salamanders and our tree frogs and more forest associated species. And so this tells us that the work that's been done in Cook County for 100 years, and that's happening right now, this legacy that Chicago has of preserving our forests and our wetlands, has preserved our species as well. And so conservation, it requires everybody. I'm on the research aspect, trying to figure out what we can do, what's worked in the past, and what can we change to create resilient landscapes. It takes action from people and our teams to do the restoration. It takes people reaching out and advocating to get the public support, to get engaged and educating about the importance of wetlands and what we can do. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to our policy and advocacy team to talk more about how we can be involved on that side of conservation. And next, and so it just takes everybody to protect all these beautiful animals that rely on wetlands at some point in their life. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. All right, as a great transition before we get into policy, it's time for another mentee. So go ahead and hop on. I'm going to change us to the next question. So that should be loaded up on your end. I want to give you a moment to put in some answers before I reveal some of the responses that are coming in. And that question is, what percentage of wetlands has Illinois already lost? All right, we're seeing quite a few responses come in, so I'll let you see that live with me. Looks like majority of folks are guessing at 90%, with some folks also guessing 40%. So that 90% is really extreme. However, those 17 of you so far that have guessed 90 are absolutely correct, unfortunately. So that is a super high percentage that we really can't look away from, right? So now we're really developing this understanding of just the significance of wetland conservation. And we're learning that context from Melissa. So now we're going to hear a little bit more about this issue from the policy perspective from Mallory currently. Let me switch us back over.
Thank you, Chloe. Okay, I'm going to start us off by talking a little bit more about what our team does at Shed and why it's so important to have advocacy somewhere like an aquarium. Next, please. So the government affairs and policy team, like Melissa's work, really represents the vision of action to safeguard our waterways for future generations. And we accomplish this in a few ways, starting with building and deepening relationships with city, state, federal, and even global decision makers to keep Shed top of mind for science-driven, impact-focused, and connection-based engagements. Next, we advocate for the animals in our care and their wild counterparts by encouraging policy that supports their current and future well-being. We form strong and lasting partnerships and coalitions to amplify our shared mission, to protect our blue planet, and we keep SHED's expertise visible in the public eye through civic engagement, which empowers people to raise their voice with SHED and inspire that collective action. In this way, our work really falls into two buckets. There's the government relations and conservation policy, whereas the relationships that we maintain with government officials support the change we seek to inspire with the conservation policies we support. These two capacities are always happening simultaneously and both support our advocacy work. All right, next slide, please. So what kinds of things do we advocate for? Well, the conservation policies we engage with are prioritized to maintain clear and consistent advocacy in 4 overarching categories. First, we have nature and wildlife, by which we aim to address the degradation, fragmentation, and loss of aquatic habitats by working to repair the connection between biodiversity, ecosystems, and people. So this looks like safeguarding our freshwater species, native species restoration, and invasive species mitigation, rescue and rehab, endangered species protection, and so on and so forth. Next, we tackle plastic and pollution reduction by leveraging evidence-based policy solutions to slow and hopefully stop the unsustainable flow of plastic into our waterways and communities. So this includes things like reduction of single-use plastics, PFAS and microplastics reduction, and prevention of chemical runoff and algal bloom. Next, we have equal access to nature, whereas we increase personal connections to nature while decreasing in human environmental impacts. We do this by focusing on people's right to recreate, beach, wetlands, and river access, especially in urban areas, and prioritizing clean drinking water for our communities. This is especially true for those places where people have been overburdened by the negative impacts of climate change, and support for their livelihood has been historically unseen. And lastly, we understand how changes to our climate affect wildlife, both now and in the future, and how our collective actions can contribute to solutions. So our focus areas here include climate resiliency, carbon reduction, protecting coastlines and responding to extreme weather events, and supporting healthy fisheries and aquaculture. Next slide, please. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into plastics because it's a really good case study for how our advocacy works. On the left-hand side there, you'll see an example of what working with our coalition partners on a shared issue looks like. That is a letter signed by zoo and aquarium CEOs to the Biden administration to lead on negotiations for a UN global plastics treaty. This was written in partnership with AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and ACP, the Aquarium Conservation Partnership. And this really showcases the power of zoo and aquariums in advocating for global change. Then down there on the right-hand side is an example of the visibility of our advocacy in action. That is a recent tabling event we held on the floor at SHED on Earth Day, where our guests raised their voice to their state lawmakers on the foam foodware and plastic bag ban bills by signing physical letters to their representatives on why they want to see less plastic in their communities. And those letters were then hand-delivered to their legislative offices. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we work with partnerships and coalitions to achieve our shared mission. And nowhere is this more true than in the Great Lakes region. At SHED, we have a daily view of Lake Michigan. It's beautiful, and we're constantly reminded of how finite fresh water is. Indeed, the Great Lakes constitute 21% of the just 3% of fresh water available to the world. For this reason, we must keep fresh water on the main stage, and by coming together with partner organizations like the Illinois Environmental Council, the Alliance for the Great Lakes, Friends of the Chicago River, and so many more, we embody that sentiment that our advocacy is stronger together. Next slide, please. So how do we advocate for fresh water? Well, at the state level, we support policies like our star of the show, the Wetlands and Small Streams Protection Act. We've successfully opposed and shut down a bill that would permit the non-selective trapping of snapping turtles, like the one we have at Shed, Dante. You can see him there on the right. And then there's plastic. Plastic reduction is one of those issues that affect every ecosystem on Earth. So our advocacy there is not limited to freshwater, but it's certainly a freshwater issue. 89% of the litter found on Great Lakes beaches is plastic. So those plastic bills like the foam foodware ban and the plastic bag ban in Illinois are great examples of this, as well as bill packages that fund research in the Great Lakes, such as on the impact of microfibers and microplastics on humans and wildlife. So moving on to federal issues, again, we fight to keep freshwater on the main stage. So at the national level, we're talking to policymakers about things like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or GLRI, which awards hundreds of millions of dollars in grants to support Great Lakes work like climate resiliency and community outreach projects. There's the recently reintroduced by Illinois Senator Dick Durbin, the Plastic Pellet Free Waters Act, which aims to ban tiny plastics called nurdles, which fish eat mistaking for food because it looks a lot like fish larvae. And then there's the UN Global Plastics Treaty, which we saw advocacy for a few slides back. Things like establishing a national marine sanctuary in the Great Lakes region, NOAA funding for coastal resiliency. NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And then there's endangered species protection, not just for our marine friends, but our freshwater ones too. So with all that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Brian to do a deeper dive into wetlands and what our advocacy looks like there.
Thanks, Mallory. So the reason for the focus on wetlands that we're having today, and that Shed has really been working on over the last 6 months, is that last year, the U.S. Supreme Court, in what is known as the Sackett decision, rolled back Clean Water Act protections for many wetlands and streams and waters, including freshwater wetlands that, as Dr. Youngquist outlined, animals rely on for habitat, Illinoisans rely on for flood control, for recreation, that act as sponges and filters to combat water pollution and emissions and more. So if we go to the next slide, what the ruling said was that the Clean Water Act protections only apply to wetlands that have a continuous surface connection to navigable waters. And so basically what that means is, can you take a boat from one to another? Can you move goods from one to another? However, many wetlands are isolated. So they're off on their own. They're not next to a river or a creek or a lake. Leaves them open to development. So you can build structures on them. You can fill them in with concrete and create a driveway if it's on private land, or create a shopping mall. Illinois, like most states in kind of the post-Sackett world, lacks a comprehensive program to protect our wetlands that are no longer federally protected. So it really leaves a lot of kind of unknowns in terms of defining wetlands and streams, permitting processes for development, and more things that were covered in those Clean Water Act protections. So as 17 of you, I think, rightly answered earlier, even before all of this, over time, Illinois has already lost around 90% of its wetlands. And so when this happened, this was kind of a big alarm bell for those of us who work in this space to get together. So if we go to the next slide, in kind of reaction to the second decision, a lot of different environmental groups got together to talk about how we respond. And so since then, Shed has been working with a really big coalition of partners across the state and, frankly, across the country, to work on a bill called the Wetlands and Small Streams Protection Act that would aim to protect Illinois wetlands and streams. So earlier in this legislative session, which we are in the ninth inning, it runs through for about another week and change. But the legislative session in Illinois runs from January essentially through the end of May. but the Wetlands and Small Streams Protection Act was introduced to kind of fill in the gaps and restore protections that were in place before the Sackett decision. So the Supreme Court decision really muddied the waters about what streams and wetlands are or are not protected. And the proposed legislation would provide clear long-term guidance that allows both businesses and developers to plan and accordingly and around an efficient and fair permitting process. It would empower the Illinois Department of Natural Resources to regulate land use around states' remaining wetlands. And so it really would provide kind of a long-term framework for us to make sure that Illinois' remaining wetlands are protected in the way that they were protected just a year or so ago. In addition to just being good policy, because these wetlands are so important to both wildlife and to people, protecting freshwater is just really popular with voters. In a survey that was done last year in 2023, about 75% of U.S. voters said that pollution of rivers, lakes, and streams, they rated it as a top conservation issue. So nearly 3/4 of voters across the country are saying protecting freshwater is very important to them. The other benefit, I would say, on top of just kind of protecting Illinois' wetlands, is that the bill can be used to serve as a model for other states to follow. Often it's easier to have a starting place for a bill, to be frank, to be able to sort of copy and paste of what another state has successfully done already, as a starting point for negotiations than sort of creating one from scratch. So Illinois groups got together right away and decided we wanted to be a leader in this space, and we wanted to help other states make sure that they were set up to provide these protections as well. So, as I mentioned, we are sort of in the home stretch of the Illinois legislative session. We'll know in the next week or so, and efforts are continuing literally as we speak. There are folks talking to legislators in Springfield, kind of whether the bill passes. And if it does, whether it does or doesn't, even if it doesn't mean that kind of that fight is over. It just means that next year we will probably need to rework some things and renegotiate with different legislators and groups, and try again next year. There are also some other opportunities kind of later in the year where the legislature opens up for short periods of time. So while we're optimistic and kind of looking at ideally for this to pass in the next week, we'll continue kind of working on this and advocating for it, even if it doesn't. So on the next slide, we wanted to give you just a little look into some of the things that Shed has done. Oh, excuse me, sorry, before I get too far ahead of myself, I'm going to hand it back over to Chloe for another mentee question, and then we'll pick it back up.
Thanks, Brian. A little bit of a spoiler here, but we're on our next mentee. So once again, I'm going to switch the mentee over. You should see a new question now that we're learning about these issues a little bit more in depth. Let's get some ideas. Who do we think should support wetlands? Individuals, government, nonprofits, or all of the above? And I'm going to take us to that mentee because the answers are coming in quick. It looks like 100% of folks so far have said all of the above. And I think I would be speaking for all of us on the panel. However, I think that we would all agree with that same sentiment. So now that we are learning a little bit more about who we think should be supporting, we can learn some more from Brian about how to support. So I'm going to bring us back to those slides. Thanks all of you for participating.
So while I agree with both the one person who said individuals should do what they need to do, as well as the 19 people who said individuals, governments, and nonprofits, which Shed as one, should do to protect wetlands, I am most in the camp of everyone. In general, conservation is everyone's responsibility, and it's everyone has a role in this process. So we wanted to give you a little bit of a look into some of the things Shed has done to advocate for wetlands this year. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see it has really been a team effort. So our government affairs team has worked to advocate for co-sponsors for the bill, which is sort of a critical early step in the legislative process. You need to have leaders to be able to take up the mantle and sort of lead that process. We've sent out action alerts through our Surge newsletter to offer Shed members and supporters opportunities to make their voices heard. We've linked to those through our social media periodically as well. We've worked to bring sort of wider scale attention to the issue through both programs at large events. So recently we were at the Aspen Climate Conference in Miami with Governor Pritzker, with Illinois Governor Pritzker, talking about the importance of freshwater. And we've also published op-eds in both the Tribune talking about specifically Illinois' wetlands, and also in the Miami Herald because of the Aspen conference, more focused on the Everglades, but sort of bringing attention to the issue across the country. Our researchers, like Dr. Youngquist, have helped bring expertise on the importance of wetlands and the science behind what we're talking about to the advocacy community. And then, just as we've mentioned, this is both a team effort inside of Shed, but also outside of Shed. And we work with so many great partners across Illinois and nationally on advocacy. So on the next slide, if you're looking to get more involved in kind of conservation from both the hands-on side and the policy side, Shed has a newsletter called Surge you can sign up for, where we send out opportunities to raise your voice and take action. You can sign up for a kayaking for conservation event we do for beach cleanups and for action days. All of that you can find on the Shed website. And then here again is just a small group of partners we work with, and just some of my personal favorites that offer some pre-written letters you can customize and send to elected officials on these issues. You can sign petitions. They offer social media opportunities, attend other events, all sorts of stuff. And then on the next slide, I would just be remiss to not remind you that your elected officials are there to serve you. So you can and should contact them directly to tell them what is important to you. At the link we put in there, and I think we'll put in the chat, you can find all of your federal, state, and local elected officials and their contact information for their offices. And then last but not least, especially because we're in an even year, we're in an election year, it's really important to get out and vote. So vote.org is a really great resource to find all sorts of information about voting. So you can check your voter registration on there. If you're not registered to vote, it can give you information on how to do that. You can find out who's on your ballot. You can set up election reminders. You can even make a plan to go vote. Like, I'm going to go vote on this particular day at this time at this location, and make sure you're all set to lower all of the barriers that there are to take part in the process. So with that, I will hand it back over to Chloe, and I know we'll have some questions in a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. So now it's time for the Q&A. We got to learn so much about wetlands, some more about these issues and what we can do, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions. So the easiest way for you to participate and ask those questions is going to be through Menti or through the Q&A directly through Zoom. I've got both open in front of me right now. I am going to go ahead and spotlight our panelists. That way, when these questions roll through, we can see their wonderful faces answering them for us. All right, we've got our first question. That question is, do wetlands ever cause flooding?
I would say no, wetlands do not cause flooding. Torrential downpours, so a lot of rain coming down all at once, and then kind of where that ends up. So if that rain is hitting pavement, it can't soak into the ground and be absorbed. And so then that pools somewhere. And if there's no wetland or natural space or soil to absorb that water, then we get urban flooding. And so we see more flooding events with climate change because we get more and more of these extreme precipitation patterns, like we had last summer, where that kind of cloud of rain just hung around Chicago, I think, for like all day. And because Chicago was wetland and we have paved that wetland, that's where we get flooding from.
Our second question, which I love, how can we support wetlands in our backyard?
Yeah, so I would say that a lot of things we can do in our own like backyards, like in Chicago, if you have an urban or suburban area, and you do find you have some flooding in your yard, is to plant native plants that kind of take up that water. And so you can make a rain garden. And that's where you're planting, sedges and other flowering plants that are really good at absorbing and taking up water and putting in good soils that are going to absorb that water. And so rain gardens are a really great way to have sort of backyard wetlands if you don't have space to like make your own pond. And if you do have a larger property and you want to have a legit like pond or wetland out there, again, you want to make sure you've got those native plants around that's going to support our native biodiversity. Native plants all the way.
How much risk are Illinois wetlands in if the bill doesn't pass this month or year?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have an exact kind of quantitative answer for you, because a lot of the problem with what happened in the court decision last year is that it leaves a lot of unknowns in sort of this permitting process for development and things. So I think if we're able to get something done next year, I would venture to say it takes developers a little bit of time usually to kind of plan things out and go through permitting processes. But if this dragged on for years, that's where we would get really, really concerned about larger swaths of wetlands being filled in.
And what tips might you have for contacting and communicating with our elected officials?
I'd say a couple things. I think one, the best thing you can do is contact elected officials who represent you. So going through your, who you are a constituent and a voter for. While it's great to contact, say, like whoever's the loudest elected official on a specific topic, the ones who really listen to you are the ones who you vote for and who know they have to count on your vote when they come up for re-election. So I would say be clear on what's important to you, give reason, make it personal, kind of why is this so important to you? Both from it's important to me that we protect wetlands because they help with flood control and they act as filters. And my kids are going to drink water, that passes through this eventually. But also if you have personal stories, I grew up going to this forest preserve, or I grew up going to this area. It's really important to me that it stays accessible. That kind of stuff can really resonate. And then I would say start with sort of where you're comfortable. Shed offers some, and some of our partner organizations try and make it sort of as easy as possible to, give you a template or a something to start with, and let you kind of customize what you want to do.
Another question we have is, Dr. Youngquist mentioned an area that was converted to forest and then to wetlands. Why would wetlands be preferred over the forest?
Right. So one reason to be historically it was wetland habitat. And so you want to go back to as sort of pre-Western settlement, degrading the habitat as we can. And so if the area was naturally grassland wetland, with restoration, that's what we're trying to get back to. In that particular case, that was part of the mitigation for the O'Hare Airport expansion. And so there was specific regulation for wetland mitigation, meaning that with the construction of O'Hare, some wetlands were lost. And so the forest preserves had to find a place to sort of create or restore wetlands that were previously degraded. And so that particular example used to be wetland, and there was legal reasons for the county to make more wetlands. And so that site was chosen.
Now, the next question is something that I brought up at the very beginning of this, and I would personally love to hear more about this. What are the benefits of wetlands for people?
Yeah, so again, we can start with sort of the aesthetics. If you like any kind of animal, they're connected to a wetland in one way or the other. And then it was sort of, we kind of were hyping on this sort of flood control because they tend to be a low point in the landscape where all the water goes. And so if you can keep those wetland soils, those really help with capturing and filtering that water. So that can sort of mitigate or reduce the amount of flooding you might get into your house. And as filtration, so water has to go from above ground to below ground, then gets into the groundwater and into the rivers that where we're drinking, or the lake, right? And so by having these really healthy soils and sort of healthy communities that can trap any contaminants into sort of the soils that aren't going to be affecting us either sort of through our water or through our recreation, they'll be kind of held there and kept secure and not sort of affecting health in any way.
Melissa, I would just add, and I think people often think of oceans and marine areas as in kelp forests and vegetation in oceans as kind of the climate solution portion of water, but wetlands are also really important in terms of combating climate change. They can serve as these like sponges and filters for carbon emissions and for other types of emissions that cause warming temperatures. And so one of the things we've been really focused on this year is making sure that's a story that's told from kind of the climate solution standpoint.
This individual says, I am deeply disappointed to hear about the loss of protection for our wetlands and freshwater. Is there a good way to stay aware and updated on the local legislation for our waters and land?
Mallory, you want to go for this one?
Sure. Yeah, I think reading the news and like always staying up to date on which environmental issues are happening, both nationally, internationally, and locally too, is super important. Reading the news and staying up to date that way is one way. Another way is subscribing to your local lawmakers' newsletters. They're often putting in there which bills they're working on right now. And you can sort of go through and see if there's any ones that are environmentally focused, and then which ones you might want to specifically advocate for. So that's one avenue. And the other way is by staying in touch with groups like Shed and the partners we work with. We're always posting about the work that we do. Same with our partner organizations, especially ones like IEC, who are primarily focused on advocacy and are down at our state's capital all the time talking to our legislators. You can join those groups and get constant updates on what's happening there. And the same goes for national groups as well. You can join coalition calls and go out in the field with researchers like Melissa and get your hands dirty and do that work directly. And then you can also advocate for the issues you find through those groups in the ways that Brian outlined before.
Yeah, I would say like, things like the Wetlands Initiative, like they are engaged in local wetlands and have news. The Wisconsin Wetland Association, I know it's in Wisconsin, but they're really engaged and keep up to date on sort of actions and legislation advocacy. There's wetland societies out there too, if you want to go like kind of more the science route. So I feel like there's a lot of organizations around that can also give updated news that are very wetland specific.
Our second to last question is a fun question. There's a couple different questions in here about frogs, and frogs was one of the biggest words in that word cloud. So a lot of frog lovers in the webinar today. This question is, how many different frogs live in Illinois wetlands? Do we know?
It is known. I would be hard pressed to tell you how many frogs are in Illinois, because Southern Illinois has a lot of different species than we have right here in Cook County. think we have like 13 amphibians in Cook County. I'm gonna say, oh my goodness, I could like pull out my frog book that's right behind me. I'm gonna say we're on like 50-ish amphibians in Illinois. Um, and a lot of those are frogs. Sorry, I don't have an exact number right here, right now.
Thanks, Melissa. I'm going to make this question our final question. It's for all of you. So feel free to kind of take turns with this. What made each of you want to work at the shed in conservation efforts?
I can go. I wanted to work at Shed because I've always been a huge animal lover. I grew up loving to learn about animals and especially aquatic animals. And so getting to advocate on their behalf was something I found to be really empowering and an excellent way for me to get to see animals every day at my job, but also talk about ways we can protect them in the wild.
Yeah, I agree with everything Mallory said. I particularly, I mean, I love Shed's kind of access and engagement with youth. And so, that is going to be the the group that saves us all. And so, making sure we are educating and working with students and with younger people on these issues is critical. I love that Shed is both involved locally on projects like on the South Branch of the Chicago River, as well as on global plastics issues. And so I really love kind of the breadth of work that we do here. And then just personally, I grew up on the south side of the city and grew up coming to Shed, and so I remember being a kid coming here and remembering sort of how powerful that experience was, and wanting to try and bring that to some policy advocacy.
Yeah, I got into conservation because I want to do an applied science, and that means the science is all about asking questions and answering questions. And with applied science, you are taking those answers and making real world change. And in conservation, we're asking questions about how do we make conservation effective. And Shed is really a great platform and a place to work to do that active conservation and translate research into, I'm saying the word action, but that's what it is, right? Like to make real change. And so I get to work with partners here at Shed, like Brian and Mallory, externally to say, like, what do you need? What kind of answers can I ask and answer that will make conservation more effective?
Thank you, everyone, for answering those questions. And thank you, all of you who asked questions. Those were some awesome questions. Before we go, I do want to ping things off to one of our auxiliary board members, Owen Coughlin. So I'm going to go ahead and re-share our screen over here.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Chloe. My name's Owen. I'm with Shed Aquarium's Auxiliary Board, and I just wanted to join and say that if you enjoyed today's event, don't miss out on our member Jazzin' on Wednesday, June 5th. Currently, we only have 8 p.m. entry tickets still available, so make sure to secure your spot. And as Shed supporters, you are the driving force behind preserving native wetlands through restoration and advocacy. So thank you for all the work that you do as well. And watch out for a follow-up email with links on how to get engaged on what we talked about here today. And thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone who is here. It means a lot to us that you would take the time and have that curiosity, especially for something that's so local and important to us. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for being here, everyone.